On Thursday, the 10th of November 1994, a man called Gary Samuels frantically flagged down a passing car at the side of the Mississippi River. The brother and sister who were in the car and had stopped for the man asked him what was going on. They asked him what was wrong. He went on to say that he and his wife were driving in their car when another vehicle had come out of nowhere and run them off the road and into the Mississippi River. He said their car had flipped and gone upside down and was now lying in the river, and his wife was still inside. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Barbara Lanthier. Officers arrived just after 9 p.m. and Gary pointed them to the car lying upside down in the river. He said that his wife was still inside. He had tried to pull her through the window, but she was unconscious and she'd got caught on something, so he couldn't get her out. He told them he thought there was no point in both of them dying, so he had left her there, swam to safety, and waited on the side of the riverbank while help came. Even before the officers had arrived there, another man who was just happened to be passing by had actually got into the river and jumped on top of the car that was upside down in the river. He had a torch and he was flashing it about, trying to find out what was the best way to get into the car. He and the officers who had just arrived did manage to open the car door, and they managed to drag Barbara out and onto the riverside. Rescuing Barbara took approximately 20 seconds, according to the detective on the scene. Barbara was alive, but barely. She was rushed to hospital, but she was freezing and she was unconscious. And at 9:38 p.m. that evening, she was pronounced dead. At the same time that all of this was happening, one of the officers who had gone into the river to try and help save Barbara was beginning to show signs of hypothermia. He'd only been in the water for a matter of minutes, but with the water temperatures being just 4 degrees, the effects happened quickly. Fortunately, he did make a full recovery, but Gary was rushed to the hospital at the same time, given the expectation that he would also have symptoms of hypothermia. Whilst he was there, the officers decided they needed to question him as soon as possible so that they could get the most accurate version of events of that night. Gary told the officers that he had picked Barbara up from the Clip Joint, which is the hairdressing shop that she worked at around 7:20 p.m. The couple had plans to go for dinner in the next town in Almont with a couple of their friends, and so they left the hairdressing shop and went straight to the other town. On their way there, they had decided to take a route that went underneath a bridge and had a 3-way intersection. This route took them towards the side of the Mississippi River. Out of nowhere, Gary said he heard Barbara scream, quote, "There's a car coming without its headlights on." And he saw a vehicle coming from the right side of them and it didn't have its headlights on. That caused him to swerve the car and it went straight into the Mississippi River, flipping in the process. Gary said the next thing he remembered was opening his eyes and feeling this sensation of being upside down. He managed to find a pocket of air where he stayed whilst he collected his thoughts on what his plan of action was going to be. He then opened the side window and managed to actually pull himself out. Now, as he was doing this, he said he attempted to pull Barbara towards him and out of that same window, but she got stuck on something and he was running out of air, so decided he had to leave her behind. After that, he did manage to make his way through that open window. Now, this section of the river that they were in, the water was only waist height, but because the car had flipped, it was starting to fill up very quickly. Gary swam the short distance to the shore and got out of the water and then waited there for that passing car. During his conversation with officers, he mentioned to them that he and Barbara rarely argued at all. They never fought. They'd lived together since 1985 and by all accounts were a happy couple. And during this this conversation, he also dropped in that Barbara couldn't swim. The detectives, of course, became suspicious quite early on when they realised that bits of what Gary was saying, the story that he'd told them, it wasn't quite matching up with the scene of the crime. For one thing, the area where Gary said that the accident had happened, where the car essentially ran him and Barbara off of the road, that area just didn't have enough length for the car to get to a high speed to flip itself into the river. And on top of that, there were no brake marks in the road. The first thing you do if your car is going towards a body of water and you see it happening is to brake, But there was no evidence of Gary having attempted to break at all. He also changed his story a number of times. At first, he said that it was a truck that had run him off the road. And then many months later, he changed that to the vehicle being a truck, but this time it had a plough on it. And he told other people that it wasn't a truck at all and that it was actually a car. He also changed the direction he said the car was coming from. Initially he said it had come from the right-hand side, and then later on he said that it had actually come at them head on, and that's why they'd have to swerve out of the way. Gary was quick to push for Barbara's body to be cremated as soon as possible. He didn't want to wait for the children, and he wanted to do it on his own right now. But of course, detectives were extremely suspicious of Gary's version of events, and so they managed to put a stop to that immediate cremation, and they got an autopsy conducted on Barbara's body. The medical examiner found that Barbara had a number of injuries that were not consistent with a car crash. She had no injuries where you would expect her to have them if she was defending herself against an oncoming collision, like her hand. Instead, she had injuries to her wrists and to her left elbow and her face. She had a lot of injuries to her face. It was also concluded that Barbara had water in her windpipe, meaning that most likely she did drown. Gary also had some injuries. He had 3 cuts on his face that officers thought looked a little bit suspicious. Gary gave an excuse for these cuts, saying that he'd cut himself under the dashboard. But the detectives considered that these looked like scratch marks, and they considered the possibility that they were defensive wounds from when Barbara had tried to defend herself and scratched him on the cheek. The car that was involved in the incident had been towed immediately following the crash. And the morning after his wife's death, he actually called his insurance broker to say that he wanted to move his car from where it was being stored because the fees where it was being stored were extremely high. But he was advised to leave it there. The insurance broker told him that if he had it removed before it had had a proper chance to be inspected, then he wouldn't get an insurance payout. And so Gary agreed. Kind of. He agreed on that phone call, but immediately after that, he called through to the towing facility and asked if his car could be transferred to a wrecking yard. The person on the other end of the line said that in cases like this, they actually have to wait for police to authorise that. Gary responded that he'd already spoken to his insurance broker, who had told him that it had all been taken care of and that it was fine to go ahead. That obviously wasn't the truth. And the examination of the car told detectives a lot about what had happened that night. Firstly, the gas cap was left slightly off, so it meant that when the car was flipped upside down, almost all of the gas had gone out into the body of water inside the car. The reason this is significant is because when Gary had come into hospital, when he'd been taken to hospital that night, staff noticed that his clothes smelt very strongly of gasoline, and this was in stark contrast to how Barbara's smelt. There was almost no smell of gasoline on her clothes. Now that's presumably because she'd been in the water so long that the water had sort of washed that off of her. But this was puzzling to officers because Gary had claimed that he and Barbara had been in the car for the same amount of time, roughly. And on that point, he claimed that they had been in the car in the freezing water for anywhere between 45 to 90 minutes. Again, this is extremely unlikely. That police officer that was helping out at the scene experienced severe hypothermia symptoms after just a few minutes. Gary was claiming that he actually managed to pull the window down, he managed to try and pull Barbara out and then swim to safety, all whilst having just been in this freezing cold water for anywhere up to an hour and a half. Things were not looking good for Gary, and this continued when an eyewitness came forward and said that they'd seen Gary at 7:30 p.m. on the night of the incident at his home. This again threw off Gary's version of events. He said that at that time he had been fighting for his life in this car wreck. Gary had clearly gone home before heading back out again in the car. And detectives thought this is likely when he had attacked Barbara. They stated that the likely version of events is that the two had fought and he had drowned Barbara in the hot tub. Then he had moved her body into the car, they'd driven towards the Mississippi River, and then he had staged the scene as an accident. We know the most likely motive for murder is money, and Gary had taken out 27 life insurance policies on Barbara, and he'd actually taken out one of those life insurance policies just hours before Barbara died. They totaled to a payout of over $2 million. And they also learned that Gary was a licensed life insurance seller, so he clearly understood the logistics of how the payouts would happen. And on top of that, obviously the premiums, the amount he'd have to pay each month, would be extortionate on 27 policies. But he had a plan. He had all of the payments on those policies go from a credit card account that was under Barbara's name. The credit cards in question were ones that had a death policy, which meant that if the person whose name they were under died before they had managed to pay off the debts, then they would just be wiped. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned to get a large amount of money from those insurance policy payouts, and he knew he would never ever have to pay off those large debts that he'd gotten getting to that point, because Barbara would be dead. And so the lead detective on the case questioned a number of people close to Barbara and Gary, and one of the people he got in touch with was a travel agent. That travel agent said that on the 10th of November at around 3 p.m, so that's the day that Barbara died, at around 3 p.m, she'd got a phone call from an anonymous caller who had asked that if this person got in an accident in Ontario on their way to a holiday, a vacation, then would they still get a payout? And the woman on the other side of the phone said she wasn't sure and she would need to check. And then later that day, the anonymous caller revealed himself as Gary when he came in to have a more detailed discussion about that. After that discussion, and being satisfied that there would be a payout, Gary bought that insurance policy on Barbara's life. On the 6th of June 1996, officers arrived at Gary's home and arrested him on suspicion of the murder of his wife. Detectives decided they needed more evidence, and unfortunately, there was quite a big hole in their case because on the night that this had happened, they hadn't taken specific measurements. At the time, people were just focused on trying to save Barbara. It was seen as a rescue operation, not as a crime scene. They simply didn't have the evidence they needed. But the investigating team had a plan. Although they didn't have the physical car in the water to take measurements, they did have the crime scene photos. And so, with the help of the crime scene photographer, they managed to recreate the scene exactly where that car had ended up. With that, they were able to make a number of estimates and measurements, and that version of events did not line up with Gary's version, but it did line up with the crash being intentional and not an accident at all, but a murder. Gary pleaded not guilty and the case went to trial. During the trial, the prosecution brought up the fact that Gary didn't willingly offer them information, and he actually only spoke to the police twice during the time from when his wife was killed up to the trial. He only offered up important information when he was prompted to do so. Quote, "Why did he not run to the police with information that this was a truck with a plough? Why did he wait for the police to find him in March of 1995 and then tell them? If this vehicle was true, if this truck, as he claimed in March, was truthful, why isn't he beating down the door, helping the police find this person who killed his wife? Why isn't he calling the police saying, 'What's going on? What's up? I've got information to help you. Find this person that killed my wife. And what are you doing? What's up?' There's none of that." Ultimately, Gary was found guilty and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He died in prison from cancer in 2010. Barbara Lanthier was a 46-year-old happy-go-lucky kind of woman, as described by her children. And in fact, her two sons from a previous relationship, Kevin and Sean, said that she was the life of the party. They also said that Gary had ignored her request to have her organs donated after she had died. The brothers had retrieved her ashes from the funeral home just days after the murder. They'd been on their way to Carlton Place to go and scatter the ashes where they'd previously scattered their grandmother's ashes. They then got a phone call from Gary, and he demanded that he wanted the ashes back at the funeral home. And at this point, they didn't know that a murder was on the cards. They weren't aware that was what had happened to their mum. So they took the ashes back to the funeral home and handed them over to Gary as a sign of respect. They never saw her ashes again and say that, quote, "She has no resting place. We have no place to visit her." Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. And if you've got any case suggestions, let me know down below. I'm making a list of all the case suggestions I get, and I will cover them. It might take me a little while, but if there is the information out there, I'll read the books, I'll do the research, I will cover them. I will also see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Goodbye.